In her paper on adolescence, Anna Freud describes one of the typical defences of adolescence, the defence by withdrawal of the libido to the self. Under this heading, she says that if anxieties and inhibitions block the way towards new objects outside the family, the libido remains within the self. There it may be employed to cathect the ego and superego, thereby inflating them. This seems to me to be similar to what Jung was saying in a much earlier paper called The Origin of the Hero, when he said, part of the psyche really wants the external object, but another part of it strives back to the subjective world. We are thus forced to conclude that the external object simply cannot be loved, because an overwhelming proportion of the libido prefers an internal object that rises up from the unconscious as a substitute for the missing reality. In this paper, I shall concentrate on one aspect of adolescence, namely, the wish of the adolescent to separate from the parents and the simultaneous struggle with the pull towards incestuous objects. It seems to me that this conflict, which leaves the ego fighting for survival, is well illustrated by Sophocles' play King Oedipus. I shall therefore analyze this myth to show that there are many themes related to this complex, and that the core of the complex is the need for, but resistance to, consciousness. I think it is now generally accepted that the Oedipus complex starts much earlier than Freud originally suggested. However, as Klein implies, whilst it may start in the early months of life, its presence is continuous, and it may not fully develop until later. Jung said that its full impact does not occur until adolescence. It certainly plays an important part in the psychology of the adolescent. I shall therefore ask you to take my comments about Oedipus as referring to a part of most adolescence. I am aware that by using the play King Oedipus, I am focusing on the male adolescent. Whilst it is true that this will cover the masculine part of the female, I nevertheless think that a separate paper needs to be written about the Electra complex. First, let me remind you of the main events in the Oedipal story. To Laos and his wife Jocasta, a son was born. However, even before a name had been given to this infant, Apollo's oracle foretold nothing but ill. He was destined one day to kill his father and then to become his own mother's husband. Laos and Jocasta decided, therefore, that the child should not live. They would not, however, take upon themselves the guilt of infanticide, so they gave it to a servant, a shepherd, with orders to abandon the child on the side of a mountain, and that its feet were to be pierced with an iron pin so that it might not even crawl to safety. The piercing was done, but the shepherd had not the heart to leave the child to perish. Instead, he entrusted it to a fellow shepherd, a Corinthian, asking him to take it away beyond the borders of Thebes and rear it as his own. The Corinthian shepherd took the child to his royal master, the king of Corinth, who, being childless, gladly welcomed the infant and adopted it as his own, giving it the name Oedipus, swollen foot, in commiseration for its painful treatment. When Oedipus became a young man, he heard a rumour that he had been adopted. He asked the woman, whom he believed to be his mother, about this matter, but she would only answer that she loved him. He therefore went to Delphi and asked the ministers of Apollo who his true parents were. But all he was told was that he would kill his father and marry his mother. As his parents had done, he tried to avoid the prediction. He decided not to return to Corinth, but to go to Thebes. On the way, Oedipus met a carriage carrying Laios and his driver. The driver tried to force Oedipus out of the way. A fight ensued, and Oedipus, in a rage, killed both the driver and his father Laios. When Oedipus reached Thebes some time later, he found the city in the grip of a deadly monster, the Sphinx. Those who could not answer her riddle were destroyed. Creon, who had governed Thebes since the recent death of Laios, promised the crown and the hand of Jocasta to the man who could rid the city of the Sphinx. The riddle of the Sphinx was, which is the animal that has 4 feet in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus gave the right answer: man, because in infancy he crawls on all 4s, he walks upright on 2 feet in maturity, and in his old age supports himself with a stick. As the Sphinx turned to fly away, Oedipus killed her. Oedipus was then joyfully received into Thebes as her king, and there he married Jocasta. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters. All seemed well for some time, but beneath the deceptive surface the hideous infamy and shame lay concealed. The gods could no longer tolerate in silence the affront of Oedipus's unwitting sins. Pestilence and famine brought Thebes once more to the verge of extinction. The citizens cried to their gods, chief among them Apollo, for light and healing. The oracle of Delphi replied that these scourges would not cease until Thebans had driven out the murderer of Laios. Oedipus undertook to find out who the murderer was, and with the help of the blind prophet Tiresias, he finally discovered that he, Oedipus, was the guilty man. He then realized that he had married his mother. Jocasta, in shame and grief, hanged herself, and Oedipus put out his eyes. Then he went into exile accompanied by his daughter Antigone, and eventually took refuge in the town of Colonus, where later he mysteriously disappeared from the earth. According to some versions of the myth, the reason why Laios was so cursed was that some years before the birth of Oedipus, he had seduced a young boy. This behavior had so enraged Apollo that he said that Laios would be killed by his own son. The obvious symbol of this version is that Laios was not ready for fatherhood. He had not achieved a sufficiently stable identity, which is a necessary precondition of a good enough parent. In the unconscious of parents, there are a number of expectations of varying kinds and strengths. In some, there is a hope for the saviour child or the wonder child. In the case of Laios, it could be said that this particular curse represents his unconscious murderous rivalry with its persecuting and retaliatory objects. In other words, this was Laios' Oedipus complex. The abandonment of Oedipus is the start of his story. I shall therefore take this theme first. When writing of the child archetype, Jung says, "Child means something evolving towards independence. This it cannot do without detaching itself from its origins. Abandonment is therefore a necessary condition not just a concomitant symptom. Fordham sees Jung's views on the outcome of abandonment as being too optimistic. I would agree that before separation as part of individuation is possible, there needs to be a sense of inner strength, i.e., sufficiently well-established inner good objects. Clearly, Fordham is seeing abandonment as a traumatic event taking place whilst the ego is very immature. It is easy to overemphasize the capacities of the self to such an extent that it looks as though object relations are irrelevant to the developmental process. There is, of course, no doubt about the almost infinite abilities of the self, especially when we are studying its healing and adapting capacities. But we should never lose sight of the fact that we are observing the individual within and in relationship to a particular environment. Thus, in the case of a traumatic abandonment, we may be witnessing the psyche making the best of what will be the permanently damaging effects of object loss. However, it seems to me that there is a less extreme state. A sense of abandonment can arise from the object failing to meet certain needs or failing to meet needs some of the time. And it is in reaction to this type of failure that the psyche may retreat into itself and find rescuing resources. Whilst technically abandonment has not occurred, nevertheless these patients' subjective experience and their clinical presentation leaves the observer in no doubt that what they are struggling with is a sense of having been abandoned. I therefore see abandonment as a relative term, with the traumatic abandonment described by Fordham at one end of the scale, and a sense of abandonment related to the failure of the environment at the other end. For example, when in the pre-Oedipal position a need is not met, then the infant experiences the mother as being withholding. As Winnicott observes, the idea that the mother does not have what is needed is for the child an unthinkable thought. Thus the image of the withholding mother is a defense against this anxiety, for it is easier to cope with the forlorn hope than with no hope. With the growth of the awareness that the parents have each other, we see an update on the withholding mother, namely the fantasy that the parents are giving to each other what is needed by the child. With this fantasy comes murderous rage, the wish to divide the parents, and also the sense of being unwanted and abandoned. In addition to this, a frequent cause of a sense of abandonment in adolescents arises from their need, as part of their struggle towards separation, to kill off the parental objects and maintain a spurious do-it-yourself psychology in order to prove to themselves that they do not need, or are indeed better off without, their parents. As we know, peer relationships are important, but there does seem to be a very strong element in the adolescent, well described by Anna Freud as the cathecting of the self, or, as a truculent adolescent put it, I don't need anyone. This false independence is well illustrated by another young man who briefly mentioned that he had failed to get a much-wanted job, but added, I don't care. He then quickly went on to tell me about the next job that he had in mind. The only hint of disappointment was in the typical adolescent comment that he didn't care, which, as we all know, means exactly the opposite. His rush forward to the next job, or his flight into the next adventure, was clearly part of his heroic need to avoid the feelings of loss and sadness, which were for him associated with impotence. Oedipus, with his heroic ambition to become godlike, maintains a conviction of independence, whilst unconsciously yearning and striving for the lost object. But before going into the actions of a hero, let me emphasize what seems to me to be the first stages of heroic development. When the adolescent kills off the parents, the resultant terror and anxiety brings about the denial of all aggression. This, alongside of the denial of guilt feelings and the feelings of isolation, combine to form an innocent victim psychology. Its conviction that it has no aggression and therefore no power may well result in an identity of impotence, and thus become an individual who can only complain. This psychology is an important aspect of the hero. Wherever there is a hero, you will find an innocent victim. And of course, it is the innocent victim part that the hero is trying to rescue. What this duo deny is their destructive aggression. But this particular marriage has a real value because the impotence of the innocent victim is transformed by the hero's aggression, which is justified by his conviction of having a good cause and the inner belief in what Redfern calls the hidden treasure. Whilst it is important to register the defensive nature of this heroic type of independence, it is even more important, and this was first emphasized by Jung, to recognize its purpose. As I see it, the purpose, and perhaps this is the most important task of adolescence, is to get in touch with and develop the individual's inner resources, i.e., the inner power and potentials, without which there can be no true separation. This, I think, is the main value and function of the hero archetype. It could be that the hero archetype is involved in the splitting of the self, as described by Fordham in the process of deintegration. This would also accord with Redfern's ideas about the formation and activity of the warring opposites. Its part in the growth process can be seen when we remind ourselves that Yahweh, as Jung said, is a God concept that contains the opposites in a still undivided state. As I see it, the hero is attempting this division, which is an essential stage before the integrating effects of the conjunctio. It is clear that heroic effort is needed in differentiation. That is to say, in order to emerge from the primeval soup, it is necessary for that part to stand in contrast to the unconscious, and this process of attempted differentiation is central to individuation. Before going into the next main aspect of the Oedipus story, I should like to comment on the practice of piercing his feet with an iron pin. According to some sources, this was done at that time by murderers to prevent the ghost of the victim from wandering and haunting the murderer. It seems to me that in this case the ghost represents the persecutory and retaliatory objects that the murderers are trying to defend themselves against. It is also interesting to note that the cross, as a sign of Christianity, did not come into use until the 4th century. Before that time, Christ was represented by the image of the Good Shepherd. Thus, in both the story of Christ and Oedipus, we see the shepherd as representing the enabling and supporting aspects of the father. I shall now discuss Oedipus's relationship to his foster parents and his leaving them. It seems to me that these foster parents are really a representation of the good aspect of his internal parents. The hypothesis that we are dealing with the split good and bad parents is supported by the fact that Oedipus is said not to have known who his true parents were. On hearing a rumour that he was adopted, he consulted Apollo only to be given the ambiguous message that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Not wishing to harm his good parents, he wanders off, and as I see it, he walks in a circle back to the bad parents. But why, it may be asked, would he leave the good part of his parents and stay with the bad part? Psychotherapists understand this well. It is the internal good parents which gives the individual strength and the ability to separate, whereas it is the bad internal parents that, by way of repetition compulsion, preoccupy or possess the individual. It could be said that the remainder of the Oedipal story is about his preoccupation with these bad part-object parents, from whom there can be no separation, but only the never-ending struggle of yearning and hate. I must mention here the importance of the internal good enough parents. Any definition of play must include the notion that in part it is symbolic survival activity, and we observe that when actual survival is threatened, then play, with all its riches, is no longer possible. Thus the internal good enough parents have to be supported, or in therapy somehow reinstated, before the individual can again lose himself in the creative and healing aspects of play. For Oedipus, as with many adolescents, the ordinary growth processes are experienced as being too slow. True growth patterns, like working through in therapy, can be seen as a spiral, but because of his impatience, the hero smashes up the process of time and insists on immediate action. This is because he experiences the growth spiral as being a maternal circle in which he feels trapped. But the immediacy of physical separation, whilst having a value, does not necessarily result in emotional separation. However, physical separation provides the hero with the exciting illusion of change and difference. We see this type of inflation with patients who have just acquired an intellectual insight. It is only an idea without a body, but perhaps this is in the nature of many beginnings. The idea that difference means change and separateness is nicely illustrated by a newspaper article in which a journalist is explaining the development of heavy metal in popular music. It said, "The universal appeal of heavy metal to adolescent emotional retards of all ages and nationalities has ensured its longevity. New bands evolve with uglier names and even tighter trousers. Heavy metal musicians talk about the kids with almost as much reverence as the kids talk about them. Why this mutual admiration? Simple. Everyone else despises them." Nevertheless, the wish for difference and separation has in it the idea of giving up the comforts of mother home. As Rosemary Gordon said in a recent paper, leaving paradise offers the possibility of reproduction, whereas staying put results in everlasting sterility. Oedipus's killing of Laos is portrayed in the myth as Oedipus protecting himself against the destructive forces that a young man might meet on the road of life. Notice the justification of expressing aggression in the context of a good cause. Here, the ruthless aggression can be given full vent without any sense of guilt. It is interesting to reflect that the origin of the word devil comes from the Greek word diabolos, meaning to throw across, as in a stumbling block, an obstacle, something that gets in the way. Psychologically, we can see how frustration activates murderous rage, which is then projected into the frustrating object. The object thus becomes a devil, and by using the defense of the good cause, the hero can validate his aggressive attack by projecting into the object and thereby naming it the devil. This splitting avoids all possibility of superego criticism. Many adolescents turn their fathers into devils as a way of justifying killing off the father's influence. One adolescent in such a state said to me that he was no longer dependent on his father and that he could prove it. He said that before taking any action, he would think what his father would do, and then he would do the opposite. Looking at the positive aspect of this behavior, we are seeing here an attempt at separation. Killing off that which is a way of freeing oneself from the present and moving into the future. This mechanism is well enlarged upon by Winnicott in his paper on contemporary concepts of adolescent development. But in this case, we are not witnessing the killing off of both parents, only the father. If we see the father as representing consciousness, then I must agree with Blomeyer when he says that for Oedipus the killing of the father is a symbol of his getting rid of consciousness in order to stay with unconsciousness in the form of the incestuous mother. As Neumann observes, the heroic type of masculinity has not yet freed itself from the maternal unconscious. I also think that when we see this clinically, it is linked with the magical idea that when an object is killed, you take over its power. This is similar to the primitive notion that if you kill and eat your enemies, then you take into yourself their strength. However, this type of killing is based on the denigration of the object, and whilst that facilitates the withdrawal of projected ideals, it prevents the enhancing benefits of identification. We can therefore see that Oedipus is not at this stage concerned with true separation, but is still largely concerned with removing any object or process that is preventing him from remaining in the safe paradise of mother unconscious. This wish is clearly demonstrated by the next event in the story of Oedipus, namely solving the riddle of the Sphinx. Jung reminds us that the Sphinx was the result of an incestuous union. Her mother sexually joined with her own son, which resulted in the birth of the Sphinx. Note this was also a mother-son incestuous combination. Jung therefore saw the Sphinx as standing for the terrible mother, whose meaning is the danger of incest. In this way, the Sphinx could be seen as the appropriately frustrating part of the mother, who is trying to prevent the son from taking the father's place. However, driven by ruthless power and his non-ego states, Oedipus is not able to heed the warning, and instead persuades himself that he is fit to be king. This equates to the adolescent who presents himself as an adult, but who is still really a pseudo-adult. By pseudo-adult I mean the individual who is in conflict with his child part, because it is seen as inferior or bad. This child part is therefore disowned and relegated to the shadow. As with all contents of the shadow, this part is frequently projected and then attacked. Here again we see an individual who cannot tolerate the slow growth processes, which can result in true understanding and maturity. Instead, we see the work of the trickster, who has an inflating influence on the immature ego. This results in a precocious identity, as if manhood could be arrived at overnight by the mere solving of a riddle. It may be that Laos was in a similar psychological state when he prematurely became a father. The overcoming of the Sphinx and then becoming king is a view of growth that many adolescents hold. In this way they escape from the depression of inner tensions and conflicts in the belief that all can be resolved by action. It also has to be unilateral action, for the hero-possessed adolescent is essentially orientated towards the seeming clarity of dictatorship, as opposed to the many-sided considerations of democracy. This is a king of the castle psychology, the dirty rascal being in the shadow. Again, I agree with Blomeyer when he says that the symbolic killing of the father consciousness is more readily seen than the returning to the maternal unconscious. In the Oedipal play, we see that it is the killing of Laos that preoccupies Oedipus and activates change, whereas the mother-son incest, although upsetting, is not seen as the main cause of concern. In society, the anti-authority aspects are clear for all to see, but the simultaneous regression to unconsciousness is by its nature less noticeable. I have in mind the adolescents who retreat for overly long periods into their bedrooms, or more seriously, those who sink into the drug scene crying, "All you need is love." Continuing with the Oedipal story, after a period in which all was peaceful, the gods could no longer remain silent, and in some versions of the myth, the Sphinx returned, this time in the form of pestilence and famine. It could therefore be said that since the Sphinx represents incest, that what we are seeing is the eruption of unconscious guilt. This being the case, it is at this point in the story that we see the intensification of the battle between the drive towards consciousness and its resistance. Clearly, the hero's identity is only possible for as long as his aggression can be seen as good. As soon as there is a possibility of seeing the contents of his shadow, then his identity comes under threat. Of course, we know that the transformation of the hero is only possible with the integration of the shadow as part of the internal marriage of the opposites. As Jung says, a content can only be integrated when its double aspect has become conscious, and when it is grasped not only merely intellectually, but understood according to its feeling value. Or, in Kleinian terms, the depressive position can only be achieved after the paranoid projections are withdrawn. But the hero is not going to give up his glory so easily. Again we see a parallel with patients who resist growth because it is a threat to their identity. And although they may be unhappy with their present state, change is felt to be more about loss than gain. Also, we often see adolescents who prefer the clarity of ruthlessness to the burden of having to live with their limits and the limits of reality. As one adolescent said, "If things are not as they should be, then they should be." Although in the collective unconscious the hero represents nascent consciousness, this is not to be confused with actual consciousness, with which the hero cannot cope. His reality is very partial. He identifies with those parts of himself that are seen by him as good, whereas the characteristics that interfere with this self-view are projected. Some of these characteristics, such as endurance, patience, softness, and gentleness, fascinate the hero, and when these are projected into the innocent maid, then we may see an attempt to integrate these parts by associating with friends who take the innocent maid projection. There is, of course, a different kind of fascination with the destructive, greedy, sadistic parts. This fascination takes the form of a compulsion to pursue and try to eliminate whatever form these characteristics take. Their form may be obvious, such as dragons, witches, and monsters, or deceptively they may appear to be reality-based, as with the political opposition, other religions, or other football teams. Thus, at this point in the story of Oedipus, we see him both wanting to find the murderous part of himself, but at the same time he is resisting all the evidence that will lead to its discovery. In his search, Oedipus calls upon the blind prophet Tiresias for help. It is worth digressing for a moment to look into the background of Tiresias. It is said that one day he saw snakes coupling, and he struck them with his stick, killing the female, whereupon he became a woman. Later, the same thing happened, only this time he killed the male, which resulted in his being turned back into a man. In this way, Tiresias had had the experience of being both a woman and a man. Zeus and Hera had an argument as to which sex had the most pleasure in love, Zeus insisting that it was the woman. Because of his experience, they consulted Tiresias, who said that it was indeed the woman who had the greater pleasure. This made Hera so angry that she blinded Tiresias, but Zeus recompensed him by giving him long life and the power of prophecy. There are some interesting symbols in this story. We see again this idea that by killing something you take on its character. But more interesting is the phenomenon that witnessing the primal scene results in blindness. It gives a secret knowledge, but the full impact of the parents having sexual intercourse is too much to cope with and results in turning a blind eye. It seems to me that this knowledge is too much to cope with because it threatens to make conscious the incestuous wish. Since in the primitive part of our psyche there is no difference between the wish and the deed, then the resultant overwhelming anxiety is dealt with by a retreat into darkness, away from the light of consciousness. In Sophocles' play, at the point when Oedipus is nearing realization of what he has done, his mother, Jocasta, strongly encourages him to forget all about it. She says, "Think no more of it. Best live as best we may, from day to day. Nor need this mother marrying frighten you. Many a man has dreamt as much. Such things must be forgotten if life is to be endured." If we see the negative mother as representing that part of a young man's psyche which is fearful of separation, then by studying the characteristics of this negative mother, we may gain some insight into the young man's psychology. Remember that we are not talking about the actual mother, but that part of the adolescent that is projected onto the mother. Jung says, "On the negative side of the mother archetype may connote anything secret, hidden, dark, the abyss, the world of the dead, anything that devours, seduces and poisons, that is terrifying and inescapable like fate." In other words, the appearance of the archetypal mother may represent the young man's resistance to the separating effects of consciousness. Again, Jung says, "The reason this regression is so easy seems to lie in the specific inertia of the libido, which will relinquish no object of the past, but would like to hold it fast forever. This inertia is also a passion. This dangerous passion is what lies hidden beneath the hazardous mask of incest." It is worth emphasizing that what lies behind some inertia is the unconscious incestuous wish. With adolescents, we frequently see strong swings from overactivity to almost complete inertia, which both puzzles and irritates parents, particularly fathers. Eventually, Oedipus accepts that it is he who killed Laos, his father, and that he had therefore married his mother. At this point, we might have seen Oedipus accepting his destructive part and thereby achieving an inner marriage, the depressive position. But I'm afraid heroes do not transform that quickly. Instead, we see a typical heroic response. Once the cause of the problem has been established, the Talion law comes into operation, and the blame game is rampant. Instead of the acceptance of human limitation with the possibility of learning from mistakes, we see a ruthless self-condemnation of having failed to live up to his godlike ambition. Thus the punishment has in it all the ruthlessness of omnipotence. The self-criticizing mechanism, or superego, has a survival value in that it causes us to examine the possibility that our own behavior may play some part when things have gone wrong. Then, in health, we move on to learning from the experience so that such a situation may be avoided in the future. However, if the archetypal self-criticizing mechanism is unmodified, then it remains ruthless, cruel, and may even be self-obliterating. I see self-destructiveness as being the main characteristic in all pathology. Such was the case with Oedipus, who after destroying his eyesight with his mother's brooch, separates from the city and goes into the wilderness. By the same psychological mechanism, his mother hanged herself. We see similar sadistic self-attacks in some adolescents who display strong obsessional behavior. Alternatively, the guilt is projected into another person who is then ruthlessly attacked. A 14-year-old boy recently told me, with horror, of how a boy in his class had come to school wearing swastikas and boasting that he was against blacks and Jews. I mumbled something like, underneath his show, he must have been unhappy. He soon was, scoffed the boy. Some boys beat him up after school. With regard to this second separation, Oedipus shows some positive signs of growth. The first time he separated from home, he did so by thinking that his destructive incestuous wishes could be dealt with by denial, flight, and by using the persona of the good guy. With this second separation, however, there is the loss of those whom he loved and a sense of guilt in relation to his destructiveness. I think, therefore, it can be said that Oedipus had reached a new point in the developmental spiral, in that there was a moment of consciousness, which, although destroyed again by the symbolic blinding, was nevertheless achieved. It must be true for us all that new insight and awareness is constantly being gained and lost, and each time they are gained, they have a little more certainty and a greater degree of consciousness. Also, by his leaving the city, we are perhaps seeing the most important act of all, namely, the act of sacrifice. For a true resolution of the Oedipus complex, the adolescent has to achieve sufficient inner strength in order to sacrifice the infantile objects. Freud used the concept of the castration complex as the resolving motive, but I prefer Jung's use of the term sacrifice because it contains not only the fear of retaliation by the father, but also accommodates the child's love of the parental pair. Thus, in addition to fear, the sexual wishes can be sacrificed out of love. It certainly seems to me that the inner strength needed to make this sacrifice is in part gained by the son identifying with his father, and that the transforming effects of identification can only be experienced if there has been a good enough relationship between the father and the son. With this sacrifice, we see the giving up of the omnipotent wishes, and the hero who once wanted to be a god is gradually transformed into a human, at least for the time being.